When my daughter told me I was always losing things, I didn't defend myself. I simply nodded, slipped my reading glasses off, and walked to my home office where 30 years of client files sat in what she called organized chaos. She thought my scattered desk and overflowing drawers were proof of incompetence. What she didn't know was that I was about to lose something on purpose, her entire trust fund, not out of spite, but to show her that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from watching something disappear completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Martinez, and at 58, I've spent 3 decades helping families in San Diego manage their money. I'm not the kind of financial advisor you see in glossy magazines with perfectly organized corner offices and digital everything. My workspace looks like a paper tornado hit it twice. Stacks of statements balance precariously on my desk. Sticky notes cover my computer monitor like yellow scales. And my filing system would make a librarian weep. But here's what my daughter Jessica never understood. Behind every seemingly misplaced document was a strategy. Behind every cluttered drawer was a purpose. And behind every lost receipt was a woman who had turned financial chaos into her client's security. I started my practice in 1994, fresh out of a divorce that left me with a 6-year-old daughter and exactly $437 in my checking account. I rented a tiny office above a taco shop in Hillcrest, the kind of place where the smell of carnitas drifted up through the floorboards and the air conditioning worked only when it felt like it. The previous tenant had left behind a metal desk with 3 working drawers and a chair that squeaked every time you shifted your weight. I bought a used computer from the classifieds and printed business cards at Kinko's on the cheapest cardstock they had. Those first few years were brutal. I survived on instant coffee and whatever Jessica left on her plate at dinner. I learned to read financial statements by candlelight when the electricity got shut off, studied investment theory while she did homework at the kitchen table, and made cold calls during her afternoon naps. The established firms in La Jolla wouldn't hire a single mother with a state school degree and no connections. So I built my own client base, one struggling family at a time. My first client was Maria Gonzalez, a housekeeper who cleaned offices downtown and wanted to save for her son's college education. She had $300 to invest and spoke broken English, but she trusted me because I was the only advisor who would meet her at 7 in the morning before her shift started. I helped her open a Roth IRA and explained compound interest using sugar packets at a Denny's booth. By the time her son graduated UC San Diego 15 years later, that $300 had grown to enough for 4 years of tuition. Word spread slowly through the community. The mechanic who wanted to retire before his back gave out completely. The teacher who dreamed of buying a house but thought she'd never qualify for a mortgage. The restaurant owner who needed to restructure his business loans before bankruptcy became inevitable. They came to me not because I had fancy credentials or a prestigious address, but because I spoke their language. I understood what it meant to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. I knew the panic of watching your bank balance drop to double digits. I had lived their fears. My methods were unconventional, to put it mildly. While other advisors used sophisticated software and detailed projections, I worked with handwritten charts and gut instinct. I kept track of my clients' goals on index cards tucked into coffee mugs. I remembered their children's names, their anniversary dates, their fears about money that they whispered across my cluttered desk. I built portfolios the way some people built quilts, piece by piece, with patience and an eye for how everything would look when it finally came together. Jessica grew up in that office. After school, she'd sit in the corner doing homework while I met with clients. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She watched me explain investment strategies using colored pencils and napkins. She heard me calm down panicked retirees during market crashes, talking them off ledges with a voice steady as stone. She saw me work weekends and holidays, take calls at midnight from clients who couldn't sleep because they were worried about their portfolios. What she didn't see was the magic happening behind all that apparent disorganization. By the time Jessica reached high school, my little practice had grown into something substantial. I had over 200 clients, most of them families, who had started with next to nothing and built real wealth over time. I'd helped 19 couples buy their first homes, sent 43 kids to college debt-free, and guided dozens of clients into comfortable retirements. My office had moved to a better building, though it still looked like a hurricane had passed through. I could afford nice things now, but I preferred my old desk, my squeaky chair, and my system of organized chaos that made perfect sense to me. Jessica, meanwhile, had become everything I'd hoped she could be and feared she would become. Straight A's through high school, early admission to Stanford, computer science degree with honors. She landed a job at a tech startup in Palo Alto straight out of college, stock options and signing bonus, and all the Silicon Valley perks that come with being young and brilliant and in demand. She wore designer clothes to work, lived in a sleek apartment with smart everything, and managed her finances through apps that updated in real time. She was proud of me, in her way. She'd tell her friends about her mom, who helped working families build wealth, who never charged fees that families couldn't afford, who had built something meaningful from nothing. But she was also embarrassed by me, by my messy office, my handwritten notes, my refusal to embrace the digital revolution that had transformed her world. She saw my methods as quaint at best, incompetent at worst. The trust fund had been Walter's idea, my ex-husband who disappeared when Jessica was small but reappeared when she turned 18 with guilt and back child support. He'd set aside $50,000 for her future, money that had grown steadily over the past 8 years, while she established her career. The plan was simple. She'd get access to it on her 30th birthday, a nest egg to buy a house or start a family, or whatever dreams required that kind of foundation. I'd been managing that money quietly, conservatively, the same way I managed everything else. It lived in a mix of index funds and blue-chip stocks. Nothing flashy but steady growth that compounded year after year. Jessica knew about the fund, but had never asked for details. She trusted that it was being handled properly, though she probably assumed properly meant through some automated system at a major firm, not through her scattered mother's apparently haphazard approach. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Sunday afternoon in late March. Jessica had driven down from the Bay Area for one of her rare visits, the kind where she spent more time on her phone than talking to me, but insisted she was making an effort. She was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, working on some presentation that couldn't wait until Monday. I was cooking her favorite meal from childhood, my grandmother's enchiladas that took 3 hours to make properly, while she multitasked her way through our time together. I'd been looking for my reading glasses for 10 minutes, checking the usual suspects: kitchen counter, coffee table, bathroom sink. They weren't in any of their normal resting places, which meant they were somewhere unexpected, probably somewhere I'd been distracted and set them down without thinking. This was a regular occurrence in my life, the kind of minor inconvenience that I'd learned to work around decades ago. Jessica watched me search with growing irritation. She had that look she got when she was trying to be patient but failing, the same expression she'd worn as a teenager when I couldn't figure out how to program the VCR. Finally, she sighed and closed her laptop with more force than necessary. "Mom, you're always losing things," she said, not looking at me. "Your glasses, your keys, important papers. I don't understand how you manage other people's money when you can't even keep track of your own stuff." The words hit differently than she probably intended. It wasn't just criticism, it was dismissal. It was the assumption that surface-level organization was the same as competence, that my messy desk somehow negated 30 years of successful financial guidance. It was the belief that because she couldn't see the system, there wasn't one. I found my glasses eventually, tucked behind the sugar canister where I'd left them while measuring ingredients. I put them on and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. She was 28 years old, brilliant and successful, and completely convinced that her way of doing things was the only way that mattered. She saw my scattered approach to daily life and assumed it extended to everything, including the careful stewardship of her future that I'd been quietly managing for years. That's when I made the decision that would change everything between us. I didn't announce it, didn't threaten or warn. I simply decided that sometimes the best way to prove your competence is to demonstrate what happens when it's withdrawn. Jessica thought I was always losing things by accident, It was time to show her what it looked like when I lost something on purpose. The next morning, I sat in my office before dawn, the way I had for 30 years. The building was quiet except for the hum of the vending machine down the hall and the distant sound of traffic starting to build on University Avenue. I pulled Jessica's trust fund statements from their folder. Not lost, never lost, just filed under J for Jessica in the second drawer down where they'd lived for 8 years. The account had grown beautifully over time. What started as $50,000 had become nearly $97,000 through careful reinvestment and the patient magic of compound interest. It represented stability, options, freedom, all the things I'd never had at her age, and had worked so hard to provide for her. And now I was going to make it disappear, not into my own pocket or some risky scheme, but into a place where she couldn't see it, couldn't track it, couldn't assume it was being handled the way she thought it should be. I spent the morning moving the money through a series of transfers that would make it virtually invisible to casual observation. Not illegal, not fraudulent, just relocated into accounts and instruments that didn't show up on standard statements. Some went into a trust I'd established years earlier, some into certificates of deposit under a business name she didn't know I had, some into municipal bonds that wouldn't report to the usual agencies. By noon, her trust fund had effectively vanished from any system she might think to check. The plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. I would let her discover the money was lost, watch her panic, and then see how she handled the crisis. Would she assume I was incompetent and take over her financial management? Would she blame me for being careless with something so important? Would she finally ask the questions about my methods that she'd never bothered to ask before? Most importantly, would she learn to distinguish between apparent chaos and actual incompetence? I didn't expect her to discover the missing money quickly. Jessica had never been hands-on with the trust fund, content to let it grow in the background while she focused on her career. But fate, as it often does, decided to accelerate my timeline in ways I hadn't anticipated. 3 weeks after our conversation about my tendency to lose things, Jessica called me on a Thursday evening. Her voice had an edge I hadn't heard since she was a teenager, dealing with college applications and the constant stress of trying to be perfect. "Mom, I need to ask you something about the trust fund," she said without preamble. "I'm thinking about buying a condo, and my mortgage broker wants to see proof of assets. Can you send me the latest statements?" My heart rate picked up, but my voice stayed steady. This was happening sooner than I'd planned, but I was ready. "Of course, honey. Let me look for those. You know how my filing system is." "That's what I'm worried about," she said, and I could hear her typing in the background. "Maybe you should just give me the account information so I can access everything online. It would be easier for both of us." I spent the next few days pretending to search for documents that I knew weren't where she expected them to be. I sent her on wild goose chases through old statements, outdated account numbers, and financial institutions that had been acquired or renamed over the years. Each dead end increased her frustration and confirmed her worst assumptions about my organizational skills. By the following Tuesday, Jessica was in full panic mode. She'd driven down from Palo Alto unannounced, arriving at my office with printouts and a laptop, and the kind of focused determination that usually meant someone was about to get fired. "Mom, we have a serious problem," she said, spreading papers across my desk without moving any of my existing clutter. "I can't find any trace of the trust fund. The last statement I can locate is from 2 years ago, and the account number doesn't match anything in the system now. Did you move the money? Did something happen to it?" I looked at her across my cluttered desk, this brilliant daughter who could debug complex software but couldn't imagine that my chaos might have its own logic. She was wearing her problem-solving face, the one that meant she was about to take charge and fix whatever incompetent mess she assumed I'd created. "I'm sure it's here somewhere," I said, shuffling through a stack of papers that had nothing to do with her trust fund. "You know me, I probably filed it under something that made sense at the time but doesn't now." Jessica spent the next 4 hours tearing through my office like a woman possessed. She reorganized my filing cabinets, sorted my desk drawers, and created neat piles of documents that she labeled with sticky notes in her precise handwriting. She found client files dating back 15 years, tax returns from the Clinton administration, and receipts for office equipment I'd forgotten I owned. What she didn't find was any trace of nearly $100,000 that was supposed to be securing her future. As the afternoon wore on, her initial frustration gave way to something closer to panic. She kept checking her phone, Googling account numbers, calling customer service lines that put her on hold for 20 minutes at a time. She was experiencing what every one of my clients had felt at some point, the sick uncertainty of not knowing where your money had gone. "Mom, I think we need to face the possibility that the money is actually gone," she said finally, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Maybe the account got closed and you forgot to move it. Maybe there was some kind of fee that ate up the balance. Maybe you made a mistake and invested it in something that went to zero." Each maybe was a tiny accusation, a vote of no confidence in my ability to handle something important. She was doing exactly what I'd expected her to do, assuming that my apparent disorganization extended to actual incompetence. She couldn't conceive of the possibility that I might have moved her money deliberately, strategically, as part of a plan she couldn't see. That evening, we sat in my kitchen over takeout Chinese food that neither of us really wanted to eat. Jessica had her laptop open, still searching for digital breadcrumbs that might lead back to her missing nest egg. She looked exhausted, defeated in a way I'd never seen before. For the first time in her adult life, she was facing a problem that she couldn't solve, with logic and determination and the right app. "I keep thinking about what you said," she told me, picking at her lo mein with plastic chopsticks. "About always losing things. I thought it was just glasses and keys, stuff that doesn't really matter. But if you lost track of something this important..." She trailed off, but I could hear the rest of the sentence hanging in the air. If I could lose track of her entire financial future? What did that say about my competence? What did that say about the trust she'd placed in me? What did that say about the foundation she'd assumed would always be there when she needed it? I wanted to end the lesson right then, to pull out the real statements and show her that her money was not only safe but had grown even more in the weeks since I'd moved it. I wanted to explain that sometimes the most careful stewardship looks careless from the outside, that my 30 years of success hadn't been luck or accident but the result of methods that worked, even when they didn't look like they should. But I didn't. Because Jessica needed to sit with this uncertainty a little longer. She needed to understand what it felt like to have your security disappear, to face the possibility that the foundation you'd built your plans on might not be as solid as you'd believed. She needed to learn the difference between losing something and misplacing it, between genuine carelessness and strategic invisibility. Most of all, she needed to discover whether she trusted me enough to believe that even when she couldn't see the system, there might still be one. The call came on a Wednesday morning while Jessica was sitting in my kitchen, still searching through bank websites with the desperate intensity of someone who'd lost something irreplaceable. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop, and I watched her face change as she read the caller ID. It was her boss, calling at 7:30 in the morning, which in the tech world usually meant one of two things: either something amazing had happened, or something terrible was about to. She answered with her professional voice, the one she used for conference calls and client presentations. "Hi Marcus, what's up?" But within 30 seconds, that confident tone had cracked into something much smaller and more uncertain. I couldn't hear his side of the conversation, but I could read her face like a book I'd written myself. The color drained from her cheeks first, then her shoulders sagged, and finally her free hand came up to cover her mouth in the universal gesture of someone receiving news they can't quite process. "I understand," she said finally, though her voice suggested she understood nothing at all. "When do you need me to..." Okay, I'll be there this afternoon to collect my things." She hung up and stared at her phone for a long moment, as if the screen might suddenly display different information. The coffee I'd poured for her sat cooling in front of her, forgotten in the wake of whatever earthquake had just shifted the ground beneath her feet. "They eliminated my position," she said without looking at me. "Budget cuts. The whole department is being restructured, and my role is redundant with the new AI integration they're implementing." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. 5 years with the company, and I'm redundant. Apparently, a computer can do my job better than I can. I wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, to tell her that this was temporary, that someone with her skills and education would land on her feet. But something in her posture warned me away from comfort. She was holding herself together with pure willpower, and any kindness might crack that careful control. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Here she was, facing the loss of her career just days after discovering the loss of her financial safety net. The daughter who had mocked my disorganized methods was suddenly learning what it felt like when the systems you trusted most began to fail you. Over the next week, I watched Jessica transform from someone who had everything figured out into someone who questioned everything she thought she knew about security and success. She drove back to Palo Alto to clear out her desk, a process that she described to me in painful detail over our nightly phone calls. 5 years of her life reduced to a cardboard box and a severance package that would cover her expenses for exactly 3 months. Her apartment, with its smart home features and designer furniture, suddenly felt like a liability instead of an achievement. The lease she'd signed so confidently 6 months earlier now loomed over her like a monthly reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. The stock options that had been part of her compensation package were worthless now, tied to a company that was cutting costs by eliminating people like her. She started job hunting immediately, applying to every opening that seemed remotely relevant to her experience. But the market had shifted since she'd last looked for work. The easy money of the tech boom had dried up, replaced by a more cautious approach to hiring. Companies wanted guarantees that she couldn't provide, experience with technologies that hadn't existed when she was building her career. Each rejection email chipped away at her confidence a little more. She'd been so certain that her Stanford degree and Silicon Valley experience made her bulletproof, that her skills were in permanent demand. Now she was discovering what millions of workers learn eventually, that expertise in one area doesn't automatically translate to security in any area. The worst part, she told me during one particularly difficult conversation, wasn't the unemployment itself. It was the way it made her question everything she'd built her identity around. She'd defined herself by her job title, her salary, her ability to solve complex problems with elegant code. Without that context, she wasn't sure who she was or what she was worth. She moved back to San Diego on a Friday afternoon in April, her car loaded with the remnants of her independent life. The sleek apartment had been sublet to someone who could afford the rent, and her furniture had been sold or donated or left behind. She carried her whole world in 3 suitcases and the same cardboard box from her office, and when she knocked on my door, she looked like someone who'd aged 5 years and 5 weeks. I'd prepared the guest room, the one that had been her childhood bedroom before she'd redecorated it during college, to look more adult and less personal. It felt strange to have her back in that space, to hear her footsteps on the stairs again after so many years of emptiness. But this wasn't the triumphant return of a successful daughter coming home for the holidays. This was retreat, pure and simple. She tried to maintain her routines at first, waking up early to check job boards and send out applications. She set up a workspace at the kitchen table, surrounded by her laptop and notebooks, and the kind of organized efficiency that had always been her trademark. But as the days stretched into weeks without meaningful responses, I watched that discipline slowly crumble. She started sleeping later, staying up until 2 in the morning scrolling through social media feeds that showed her former colleagues moving on to new opportunities while she remained stuck. She ordered delivery food instead of cooking, something that would have been unthinkable during her high-earning days when she prided herself on meal planning and organic ingredients. The missing trust fund became a daily obsession. Every morning, she'd spend an hour searching through different financial websites, hoping to find some trace of the money that had vanished from her safety net. She created spreadsheets tracking every lead, every account number, every customer service representative who promised to call her back but never did. She was methodical in her panic, which somehow made it worse to watch. One afternoon, I found her crying at the kitchen table over a laptop screen, showing her dwindling bank account. She'd been stretching her severance package as far as possible, but the numbers were unforgiving. In a few weeks, she'd be completely dependent on me for support, something that clearly terrified her more than unemployment itself. "I don't understand how this happened," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I did everything right. I got the degree, I built the career, I saved money and invested wisely. I followed all the rules, and now I have nothing to show for it." That word, nothing, hung in the air between us like an accusation. She was including me in that assessment, including my supposed failure to protect the trust fund that should have been her safety net. In her mind, we'd both failed her in different ways, leaving her more vulnerable than she'd ever imagined possible. The rejection emails became a daily ritual of disappointment. Companies that had courted her aggressively just a year earlier now responded with form letters thanking her for her interest, but explaining that they'd found a more suitable candidate. The job market had become brutally competitive, with dozens of qualified applicants for every position and hiring managers who could afford to be impossibly selective. She started broadening her search, applying for positions that paid significantly less than her previous salary and required skills she'd have to learn on the job. The prestigious tech companies that had once seemed like her natural habitat were replaced by smaller firms, startups with uncertain funding, and eventually, any company that might value her analytical abilities regardless of the industry. Each step down felt like a personal failure, a confirmation that she wasn't as valuable as she'd believed herself to be. The confidence that had carried her through Stanford and into the competitive world of Silicon Valley began to crumble under the weight of constant rejection. She second-guessed every decision, every word choice in her cover letters, every answer she gave during the handful of phone interviews that led nowhere. Her friends from the tech world gradually stopped calling. Not out of malice, but because success and failure often feel contagious in close quarters. They were busy with their own careers, their own challenges. And Jessica's unemployment reminded them how quickly their own security could disappear. The network she'd counted on for professional opportunities became a source of anxiety instead of support. The worst moment came during a video interview for a position that would have paid half her previous salary. The connection kept cutting out, making her appear incompetent and unprepared despite her careful preparation. She tried to restart the call 3 times before the interviewer politely suggested they reschedule, knowing they never would. She threw her laptop closed so hard that the screen cracked, then immediately burst into tears because she couldn't afford to replace it. That evening, she sat on my couch, staring at the damaged computer like it represented everything that had gone wrong in her life. The crack ran diagonally across the screen, distorting everything she tried to read, and making job searching even more difficult than it already was. She couldn't afford a new laptop, couldn't afford to fix the old one, and couldn't imagine how to continue her job search without proper equipment. "Maybe I should just give up," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this anymore. Maybe the world has moved past people like me." People like me. The phrase echoed something she'd said to me months earlier about my own work, about being outdated and left behind by progress. Now she was applying that same judgment to herself, wondering if her skills had become obsolete, if her value had expired without her noticing. I watched her struggle with the same feelings I'd lived with for years, the sense that the world had moved on without you, that the methods you'd mastered were no longer relevant, that younger, smarter people had found better ways to do everything you thought you understood. It was painful to witness, but also necessary. She needed to understand what it felt like to have your competence questioned, your worth diminished, your foundation shaken. The money situation became critical in early May. Her severance package had officially run out, and her savings account was down to 3 figures that wouldn't cover another month of basic expenses. She'd applied for unemployment benefits, but the process was slow and bureaucratic, requiring documentation she didn't have and patience she couldn't maintain. She started talking about taking any job she could find, regardless of whether it used her skills or education. Retail work, restaurant service, anything that would provide immediate income while she continued searching for something in her field. The pride that had once defined her was being systematically dismantled by the simple reality of needing money to survive. One morning, I found her at the kitchen table with a stack of applications for positions that would have horrified her 6 months earlier. Customer service representative at a call center, administrative assistant at a law firm, data entry clerk for a medical billing company. Jobs that required no special skills, offered no room for growth, and paid barely enough to cover basic living expenses. "This is what my Stanford education is worth now," she said bitterly, holding up an application for a part-time position at a retail chain. 5 years of Silicon Valley experience, and I'm competing with high school students for minimum wage jobs. She wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't seeing the bigger picture. This was what happened when you built your entire identity around external validation, when your sense of worth depended on job titles and salary figures, and the approval of systems that could disappear overnight. She was learning the hard way that real security had to come from something deeper than market demand or corporate loyalty. The trust fund obsession intensified during this period. She spent hours each day creating new theories about where the money might have gone, researching obscure financial regulations and investment vehicles that might explain its disappearance. She contacted lawyers about potential recovery options, spoke with accountants about tax implications, and even hired a private investigator who took her retainer and produced nothing useful. Each dead end reinforced her growing conviction that I had somehow failed in my responsibility to protect her financial future. She never accused me directly, but I could see the resentment building behind her careful politeness. In her mind, my disorganized methods had finally caught up with consequences she couldn't ignore. The private investigator's report was particularly devastating. He'd traced every official record he could find, and concluded that the trust fund had simply vanished into the kind of bureaucratic black hole that swallows money when proper documentation isn't maintained. He suggested that clerical errors, account closures, or unclaimed property procedures might have resulted in permanent loss. $50,000, Jessica said after reading his findings, plus 8 years of growth, just gone because nobody kept proper records. "Do you understand what this means? Even if I find a decent job tomorrow, I'm starting over completely. No emergency fund, no down payment for a house, no safety net at all." The weight of that realization settled over her like a physical burden. She'd spent her entire adult life assuming that the trust fund would be there when she needed it, a foundation that would allow her to take risks and pursue opportunities without worrying about basic security. Now she was facing the same financial vulnerability that millions of people lived with every day, and she wasn't prepared for how terrifying that felt. Her sleep patterns became erratic. I'd hear her moving around the house at 3 in the morning, making tea or pacing the living room or sitting in the dark with her broken laptop balanced on her knees. She was processing more than just unemployment and financial loss. She was grappling with the collapse of every assumption she'd made about how the world worked and her place in it. The final blow came in the form of a credit card statement that arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May. During her last month of unemployment applications and private investigator fees, her spending had spiraled beyond what her diminished income could support. The minimum payment alone was more than she could afford, and the interest charges were compounding faster than she could calculate. She stared at the numbers with the hollow expression of someone who'd finally run out of options. No job, no savings, no trust fund, and now debt that would follow her regardless of what happened next. The financial security she'd taken for granted for nearly 30 years had evaporated completely, leaving her more vulnerable than she'd ever imagined possible. That evening, she came to me with a humility I hadn't seen since she was a child, asking for help with homework she couldn't understand. She needed to borrow money to make the credit card payment, to buy groceries, to maintain the basic dignity of not being completely destitute. The daughter who had questioned my competence just months earlier was now asking me to rescue her from consequences that her own careful planning hadn't prevented. I gave her the money without hesitation, but I could see what it cost her to ask. She was learning that independence was more fragile than she'd believed, that expertise in one area didn't guarantee security in any area, and that sometimes the people you dismiss as outdated were the ones who caught you when everything else fell apart. As spring turned towards summer, Jessica settled into a routine of desperate searching that yielded diminishing returns. The job market hadn't improved, her skills hadn't become more relevant, and her financial situation continued to deteriorate despite my support. She was trapped in a cycle where every rejection made the next application harder to write. Every bill made her more desperate for any source of income. But something else was happening too, something she didn't recognize yet. The constant pressure was stripping away the layers of professional identity that had defined her for so long. Without her job title and salary and carefully curated LinkedIn profile, she was being forced to rediscover who she actually was beneath all those external markers of success. The woman who emerged from this process would be different from the one who had lost her job 3 months earlier. More humble, more resilient, more aware of how quickly circumstances could change and how little control anyone really had over their fate. She was learning lessons that no amount of education or career success could have taught her, lessons that would serve her well in whatever came next. She just didn't know yet that her real education was about to begin, or that the mother she'd dismissed as disorganized was preparing to show her what genuine competence looked like when everything else had been stripped away. The invitation came wrapped in morning sunlight and the smell of fresh coffee, so subtle that Jessica almost missed it entirely. I'd been watching her struggle for weeks, observing the way she hunched over her cracked laptop screen and the defeated slump of her shoulders when another application disappeared into the digital void. She'd grown thin during her months of unemployment, not from lack of food, but from the constant stress of uncertainty gnawing away at her from the inside. That particular Tuesday morning, she was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts of job listings, each one marked with notes in her precise handwriting about application deadlines and required qualifications. Her broken laptop was propped open at an angle that minimized the worst of the screen damage, and she was typing with the careful concentration of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled into the chair across from her, not saying anything at first, just sitting in the companionable silence that had become our morning routine. Outside, the San Diego morning was already warming into another perfect day, the kind of weather that made the rest of the country jealous and that Jessica had once taken for granted during her Palo Alto years. "You know," I said eventually, my voice casual in the way that suggested I was just making conversation, "I've been thinking about hiring someone to help me with the summer workload. Nothing fancy, just someone who's good with numbers and understands how to organize information." Jessica looked up from her screen, and I could see the immediate calculation in her eyes. Was this a real opportunity or charity disguised as employment? Was her mother offering her a pity job because she felt sorry for her unemployed daughter? The pride that had sustained her through Stanford and Silicon Valley warred with the practical reality of needing income from any source available. "What kind of help?" she asked carefully, not committing to interest but not dismissing the possibility either. I shrugged, keeping my tone deliberately offhand. "Data entry, mostly. Client information that needs to be digitized. Maybe some basic analysis of investment performance. The kind of work that requires attention to detail but doesn't need 30 years of experience to do well." It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have a backlog of paper records that could benefit from digital organization, and my client base had grown enough that some administrative support would genuinely be useful. But the real purpose of the offer had nothing to do with my business needs, and everything to do with giving Jessica a reason to spend time in my world without feeling like she was accepting charity. She considered the proposal for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table in the nervous rhythm that had become her trademark during the unemployment months. I could see her weighing the pros and cons, calculating how much she needed the money against how much it might cost her in terms of professional dignity. "Would this be temporary?" she asked finally. "I mean, I'm still looking for something in my field. This would just be until I find a real position." The phrase "real position" stung a little, though I didn't let it show on my face. In Jessica's mind, work was only legitimate if it required advanced degrees and commanded high salaries. Everything else was just marking time until you could return to your proper place in the professional hierarchy. She didn't understand yet that some of the most important work happened in places that didn't appear on LinkedIn profiles or impress former classmates at reunion dinners. "Of course," I agreed. "Think of it as a bridge position, something to keep you busy and provide some income while you continue your search." She nodded slowly, still not fully convinced but running out of alternatives. Her credit card payment was due in 2 weeks, and she'd already borrowed money from me twice for basic expenses. The arithmetic of survival was forcing her to consider options that her former self would have rejected without a second thought. "What would the hours be like?" she asked, and I knew she was going to accept the offer even if she hadn't admitted it to herself yet. "Flexible," I said. This isn't the kind of work that has to be done at specific times. Come in when you want, work at your own pace. The only requirement is accuracy. When you're dealing with people's financial information, there's no room for carelessness. That last comment was deliberate, a gentle reminder that this work mattered in ways she might not immediately appreciate. Every number she entered would represent someone's retirement dreams, someone's child's college fund, someone's hope for a more secure future. The stakes might not be as obvious as debugging software or optimizing algorithms, but they were just as real and far more personal. Jessica started the following Monday, arriving at my office with a notebook and the kind of nervous energy that accompanies any new job. She dressed carefully in business casual clothes that were probably overkill for data entry work, but made her feel more professional and less like someone accepting family charity. I showed her to a desk I'd cleared in the corner, equipped with a computer that actually worked, and a stack of client files that needed digital organization. The work itself was straightforward, but required the kind of meticulous attention that Jessica had always excelled at. Each client file contained years of investment records, transaction histories, and personal notes that needed to be entered into a database system I'd been meaning to implement for years. It was tedious, but not mindless, requiring someone who could recognize patterns and flag inconsistencies without needing constant supervision. For the first few days, Jessica approached the task with the efficiency she'd brought to every job in her career. She created spreadsheets to track her progress, developed shortcuts to speed up the data entry process, and organized the files into logical categories that made sense to her analytical mind. She worked quietly, methodically, treating each record like a puzzle to be solved, rather than information to be preserved. But gradually, something unexpected began to happen. As she entered details about client investments and account histories, she started to see patterns that had nothing to do with market performance or asset allocation. She began to recognize the human stories buried in the financial data, the life events that showed up as sudden withdrawals or unexpected deposits or changes in investment strategy. There was Margaret Chen, whose portfolio showed a significant withdrawal in 2018 that corresponded with medical bills for cancer treatment, followed by a gradual rebuilding process that reflected her recovery and return to work. There was Robert Martinez, a construction worker whose account showed decades of small, steady contributions that had grown into a substantial retirement fund, despite multiple economic downturns that had forced temporary suspensions of his investment program. Each file told a story of struggle and perseverance, of families who had trusted my guidance during their most vulnerable financial moments. Jessica found herself slowing down as she worked, reading the personal notes I'd included in each file and beginning to understand that these weren't just numbers on a screen but representations of real people's hopes and fears about their financial future. One afternoon, she came across a file that stopped her completely. The account belonged to Maria Santos, a single mother who had started investing $25 a month when her daughter was born. The investment had continued through job losses, medical emergencies, and countless other financial crises, sometimes dropping to $5 a month but never stopping entirely. Over 18 years, those small contributions had grown into enough money to pay for her daughter's first year of college. This woman saved 18 years to send her daughter to school, Jessica said, looking up from the file with something approaching awe. $25 at a time. Do you know how much discipline that requires? I nodded, remembering Maria's visits to my office and the pride in her voice when she talked about her daughter's academic achievements. She cleaned office buildings at night so she could invest during the day. Never missed a contribution, even when it meant eating ramen for dinner 3 nights a week. Jessica stared at the numbers on her screen, and I could see her doing the mental calculations. $25 a month for 18 years should have totaled $5,400, but the account was worth nearly $12,000. The difference represented the patient magic of compound interest and careful investment selection, the same principles she'd learned about in her finance classes, but had never seen applied to such modest amounts. How did you know it would work? She asked. How did you know that $25 a month would actually make a difference? The question revealed something important about Jessica's understanding of investing and money management. In her world, financial strategies required significant starting capital and sophisticated instruments. The idea that small, consistent contributions could create meaningful wealth over time was theoretically sound but practically foreign to her experience. I didn't know it would work, I admitted. But Maria believed it would, and that was enough to start. Everything else was just time and patience and trusting the process even when it didn't look like progress. Over the following weeks, Jessica began asking more questions about the files she was entering. She wanted to understand the investment strategies I'd recommended for different clients, the reasoning behind asset allocation decisions, and the market conditions that had influenced portfolio adjustments over the years. Her questions revealed a curiosity that went beyond simple data entry, a growing interest in the human side of financial planning that her previous career had never exposed her to. I started explaining my methods as she worked, describing how I evaluated each client's risk tolerance and investment timeline. I showed her how to read between the lines of financial statements to understand the personal circumstances that shaped investment decisions. Most importantly, I began to share the stories behind the numbers, the conversations and relationships that turned abstract financial planning into deeply personal guidance. "This is completely different from what I expected," Jessica told me one afternoon as she finished entering data for a client who had successfully navigated retirement despite 3 major market crashes. "I thought financial planning was all about maximizing returns and minimizing risk. But this feels more like counseling than investing." She was beginning to understand something that had taken me years to learn, that managing money was ultimately about managing emotions, fears, and dreams, rather than just assets and portfolios. The technical aspects of investing were important, but the human aspects were what made the difference between success and failure over the long term. The transformation in Jessica's perspective became evident in small ways at first. She started reading the financial news with different eyes, paying attention to how market changes might affect regular people rather than just institutional investors. She asked me about clients who had faced job loss or medical emergencies, wanting to understand how financial planning could provide stability during life's inevitable disruptions. One day, she discovered a file that contained a decade of correspondence with a client who had been struggling with gambling addiction. The investment account showed a pattern of contributions followed by complete withdrawals, then new contributions as the client tried repeatedly to build financial security while battling his compulsive behavior. The notes showed years of patient support and restructured investment plans designed to work around the client's limitations. "You didn't give up on him," Jessica observed, reading through the detailed notes that documented each setback and restart. "Even when he kept destroying his own progress, you kept trying to help." "Some clients need more than investment advice," I explained. "They need someone who believes they can succeed even when they don't believe it themselves. Financial planning isn't just about money, it's about hope." That conversation marked a turning point in Jessica's understanding of what my work actually involved. She began to see that the apparent disorganization of my office masked a deep understanding of human nature and financial psychology. The scattered papers and overflowing files weren't evidence of incompetence, but artifacts of a practice built on relationships rather than systems. She started staying later in the office, not because the work required it, but because she was genuinely interested in learning more about the clients whose files she was processing. She read every note, studied every investment decision, and began to understand the careful balance between optimism and realism that successful financial planning required. One evening, as we were closing the office after a particularly productive day, Jessica made an observation that surprised both of us. "You know, this work is actually more intellectually challenging than my old job. The technology part was just following algorithms and optimizing code. But this requires understanding people, predicting behavior, managing emotions. It's like being a therapist and a mathematician at the same time." I smiled at that assessment, remembering my own early assumptions about financial planning before I learned how complex and nuanced the work could be. Jessica was discovering that helping people achieve financial security required skills that couldn't be coded or automated, insights that came from experience rather than education. The missing trust fund hadn't been forgotten, but it had moved from the center of Jessica's daily anxiety to a background concern that occasionally surfaced during quiet moments. She was too busy learning about my clients and their financial journeys to spend hours each day obsessing over her own financial loss. The work was providing something more valuable than income. It was giving her a sense of purpose that had been missing since her job loss. As summer progressed, Jessica's role in the office evolved beyond simple data entry. She started suggesting improvements to my record-keeping system, developing spreadsheets that could track client progress more efficiently, and even drafting follow-up letters for clients whose portfolios had reached significant milestones. Her technology background proved useful in ways that neither of us had anticipated, allowing her to streamline processes that I had been handling manually for years. But more importantly, she was beginning to understand the value of work that couldn't be measured in stock options or annual reviews. She was seeing how financial security could change people's lives in ways that went far beyond their bank balances. How careful planning could provide peace of mind that no amount of immediate income could replace. One afternoon, Maria Santos stopped by the office to discuss her daughter's sophomore year expenses. Jessica happened to be working late that day, and I introduced her as my assistant who had been helping organize client records. Maria immediately recognized her account from Jessica's work and thanked her for the careful attention to detail she'd shown in preserving her investment history. "Your mother changed our lives," Maria told Jessica with genuine warmth. "When I started investing, I didn't even know what compound interest meant. She taught me that small amounts could become big amounts if you just kept going. My daughter is going to graduate college without any debt because of what we learned here." After Maria left, Jessica sat quietly at her desk for a long time, staring at the computer screen without really seeing it. I could tell she was processing something important, wrestling with ideas that challenged her previous assumptions about value and success and meaningful work. "I used to think this kind of work was simple," she said finally. "Just basic math and common sense. But watching you with clients, seeing how their lives have changed over time, it's actually incredibly complex. You're not just managing money, you're managing dreams." That evening, as we walked to our cars in the parking lot behind my office building, Jessica made a comment that revealed how much her perspective had shifted over the past few months. "I'm starting to understand why you do this work. It's not about the returns or the fees or even the business success. It's about being part of something that actually matters in people's lives." She was beginning to see what I'd hoped she would discover, that competence wasn't always visible from the outside, that some of the most important work happened quietly and without fanfare, and that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with salary figures or professional status. The student was ready to become the teacher, though she didn't know it yet. The real lessons were just beginning, and they would change everything she thought she knew about money, security, and the difference between being smart and being wise. The morning Jessica discovered my real filing system, everything changed between us. It happened by accident, the way most important revelations do. She was looking for a specific client file that I'd mentioned during a conversation about tax loss harvesting strategies, and I'd given her what I thought were clear directions to find it in my seemingly chaotic office. She'd been working with me for 3 months by then, long enough to develop her own theories about how my disorganized methods actually functioned. She'd assumed that my paper filing system was purely chronological, or maybe alphabetical with significant gaps and errors. What she discovered that morning was something entirely different, and far more sophisticated than anything she'd imagined. The file she was looking for wasn't where logic suggested it should be. Instead of being filed under the client's last name or account number, it was tucked into a folder labeled Market Volatility 2008, along with a dozen other accounts that seemed to have nothing in common except their timing. When she opened the folder, she found detailed notes about clients who had panicked during the financial crisis and needed specific psychological support to avoid making catastrophic investment decisions. Her curiosity piqued, Jessica began exploring other seemingly random folders. Health emergencies contained files for clients who had needed to restructure their portfolios due to medical expenses. Job transitions held accounts for people who had lost employment or changed careers and required different investment strategies. Divorce recovery documented the careful rebuilding of financial security for clients whose lives had been upended by relationship failures. Each folder was organized around life events rather than alphabetical order, around emotional needs rather than account values. My filing system wasn't chaotic at all. It was deeply strategic, designed to help me quickly access the information I needed to serve clients facing similar challenges. When someone called in crisis, I could immediately pull examples of how other people in similar situations had successfully navigated their difficulties. "This is brilliant," Jessica said when she finally understood what she was looking at. "You've organized everything around problem solving rather than record keeping. When Mrs. Rodriguez calls because her husband has been diagnosed with dementia, you don't need to remember her account number. You just go to your long-term care folder and you have a dozen examples of how to handle that exact situation." I nodded, pleased that she was finally seeing the method behind what appeared to be madness. 30 years of client relationships teaches you that people don't call with account numbers and portfolio questions. They call with fear and confusion and life crises that happen to have financial implications. My system reflects how people actually live, not how financial institutions think they should organize their lives. This discovery transformed Jessica's understanding of everything she'd observed during her months in my office. The scattered papers weren't evidence of poor organization. They were active research materials for ongoing client situations. The overflowing desk drawers weren't signs of neglect, but repositories of solutions I developed for problems that repeated themselves across different clients and decades. The apparent chaos was actually a sophisticated information management system designed around human psychology rather than corporate efficiency. She began studying my methods with the same intensity she'd once applied to learning new programming languages. She wanted to understand not just what I did, but why I did it, not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them. She started asking different kinds of questions, focusing on the reasoning behind my approaches rather than just the mechanics of implementation. How do you know when someone is ready to hear bad news about their portfolio? She asked one afternoon as we reviewed accounts that had underperformed during a recent market correction. And how do you know when they need encouragement versus when they need honest assessment of their situation? These were the kinds of questions that couldn't be answered with spreadsheets or algorithms. They required understanding people at a level that went far beyond their financial statements, reading emotional cues that were often more important than market indicators. Jessica was learning that successful financial planning was as much about timing and communication as it was about asset allocation and risk management. I began sharing more of the decision-making process with her, explaining how I evaluated not just investment options but client personalities, family dynamics, and life circumstances that influenced financial choices. She learned to recognize the signs of impending divorce in joint accounts, the patterns that suggested someone was struggling with addiction, the subtle indicators that revealed when clients were being pressured by family members to make poor financial decisions. Her technology background proved invaluable once she understood the human elements of the work. She created databases that could track client emotional states alongside their portfolio performance, systems that flagged accounts requiring extra attention during stressful life events, and automated reminders for check-ins during market volatility periods when clients were most likely to make fear-based decisions. But Jessica's most significant contribution came when she suggested creating educational materials that could help clients understand their own psychological responses to financial stress. Drawing on her experience with user interface design, she developed guides that explained complex financial concepts in language that regular people could understand and apply to their own situations. Most financial education assumes people make rational decisions based on complete information, she observed as she worked on a guide about dollar-cost averaging. But your clients aren't making rational decisions, they're making emotional decisions that they're trying to rationalize. The education needs to address the emotional component first, then introduce the rational framework. She was learning to think like a financial counselor rather than a financial analyst, to prioritize psychological comfort over mathematical optimization, to value long-term behavioral sustainability over short-term performance gains. These were insights that couldn't be taught in business school or learned from financial websites. They came from years of watching people make both wise and foolish choices with their money. The transformation in Jessica's professional identity became evident in her daily conversations. She stopped checking job boards obsessively, stopped updating her LinkedIn profile every few days, stopped measuring her worth against her former colleagues' career progression. The work we were doing together had given her a sense of purpose that transcended traditional markers of professional success. One afternoon, a client named David Park called in a panic because he'd heard rumors about his company's upcoming layoffs and wanted to immediately withdraw all his retirement savings to protect against potential job loss. Jessica happened to answer the phone, and I watched her handle the conversation with a combination of empathy and expertise that impressed me deeply. She listened to his fears without dismissing them, acknowledged the legitimate stress of facing potential unemployment, then gently guided him through the mathematics of early withdrawal penalties and tax implications. More importantly, she helped him understand that financial security came from having resources available during difficult periods, not from hoarding cash out of fear of what might happen. "I understand you're scared," she told him, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from truly understanding both the numbers and the emotions behind them. "But let's talk about what financial security actually looks like if you do lose your job. You need liquidity for immediate expenses, but you also need to protect your long-term retirement security. Let me show you some options that address both concerns." By the end of the conversation, David had agreed to maintain his retirement investments while building a separate emergency fund for potential job loss expenses. It was exactly the kind of balanced approach that protected both his immediate peace of mind and his long-term financial security, the kind of solution that required understanding people rather than just markets. After the call, Jessica sat quietly for a moment, processing what had just happened. 6 months ago, I would have told him to optimize his portfolio for maximum returns and not worry about emotional responses to market volatility. But that's not what he needed to hear. He needed someone to understand his fear and help him make decisions that he could live with, regardless of what happened with his job. This was the moment I knew she truly understood what financial planning could be at its best. Not just technical expertise, but emotional guidance. Not just mathematical optimization, but human support during life's inevitable uncertainties. She was learning to use her analytical skills in service of something larger than algorithms and code, something that connected directly to people's deepest needs for security and hope. As autumn approached, Jessica began taking on more complex client interactions. She sat in on retirement planning meetings, helped develop investment strategies for young families, and even led some of the educational workshops I offered quarterly for existing clients. Her ability to translate complex financial concepts into accessible language made her particularly effective with clients who had been intimidated by traditional financial planning approaches. Her presentation on financial planning for life transitions drew the largest attendance we'd ever had for a client workshop. She covered job changes, marriage, divorce, parenthood, and retirement, not as separate financial challenges, but as interconnected life events that required flexible strategies and emotional intelligence. The feedback from attendees was overwhelmingly positive, with several clients specifically requesting to work with Jessica on their upcoming financial decisions. "I never thought about financial planning as emotional support," one client told her after the workshop. "But when you explained how to prepare financially for life changes we can't predict, it made sense in a way that all the investment advice I've gotten before never did. You're teaching us how to be financially resilient, not just financially successful." The success of her workshop led to requests from other financial advisors who wanted Jessica to present similar programs for their clients. She was developing a reputation in the local financial planning community as someone who could bridge the gap between technical expertise and human understanding. Someone who could make complex financial concepts accessible without oversimplifying them. But perhaps the most significant change in Jessica was her growing confidence in questioning conventional financial wisdom. She began challenging industry assumptions about optimal investment strategies, risk assessment methods, and client communication approaches. Her technology background gave her insights into how automated financial services were failing to address the human elements that made the difference between success and failure for most people. "Robo-advisors can optimize portfolios based on historical data and mathematical models," she told me during one of our evening discussions about the future of financial planning. "But they can't talk someone off the ledge when the market crashes. They can't recognize when a client's investment behavior is being driven by relationship problems or family pressure. They can't provide hope when everything feels hopeless." She was articulating something I'd felt for years but hadn't been able to express so clearly, that the human elements of financial planning were not inefficiencies to be automated away, but core competencies that distinguished meaningful guidance from simple transaction processing. The technology could handle the calculations, but it couldn't handle the conversations that actually determined whether people achieved their financial goals. By November, Jessica had become indispensable to my practice in ways that went far beyond the data entry work that had originally brought her into my office. She was contributing ideas for improving client services, developing educational materials that other advisors wanted to license, and building relationships with clients who specifically requested her involvement in their financial planning process. More importantly, she had found work that utilized all of her skills, analytical, technological, and interpersonal, in service of something that felt meaningful and sustainable. She wasn't just earning income or building a career, she was developing expertise in an area that would only become more valuable as she gained experience and built relationships. The missing trust fund had become almost irrelevant to her daily life. She mentioned it occasionally, usually in the context of appreciating how much her perspective on financial security had evolved since her months of unemployment and uncertainty. She understood now that real security came not from having money in the bank, but from having skills that could generate income and create value regardless of economic conditions. "I used to think my trust fund represented security," she told me one evening as we finished updating client files for the quarterly review process. "But working here has taught me that real security comes from being able to help people solve problems they can't solve themselves. The money was just a number. This work is something that can't be automated or eliminated or lost to market crashes." She was learning the difference between having wealth and building wealth, between accumulating assets and developing capabilities, between financial independence and financial wisdom. These were lessons that couldn't be taught in textbooks or learned from websites. They came from watching people make both good and poor financial decisions over time and understanding the patterns that separated success from failure. As winter approached, Jessica made a decision that surprised both of us. Instead of returning to her job search in the technology sector, she decided to pursue formal certification as a financial planner. She wanted to build on the foundation of practical experience she'd gained in my office and develop the credentials that would allow her to serve clients at the highest level. "I want to do this work for real," she told me as she submitted her application for the certification program. "Not just as a temporary bridge until something better comes along, but as my actual career. I've found something that uses everything I'm good at and makes a difference in people's lives. Why would I want to go back to optimizing algorithms for companies that lay people off whenever the stock price needs a boost?" The transformation was complete. The daughter who had dismissed my work as outdated had become someone who understood its value better than most people in the financial services industry. She had learned that competence wasn't always visible from the outside, that some of the most important work happened quietly and without recognition, and that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with salary figures or professional status. But she still didn't know about the trust fund. That revelation was still to come, and when it did, it would complete her education in ways that neither of us could have anticipated. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in December, addressed to Jessica in handwriting she didn't recognize. It had been delivered by courier to my office, marked personal and confidential, in the kind of formal language that suggests legal documents or official business. Jessica opened it while sitting at her desk, expecting another piece of correspondence related to her financial planning certification program. Instead, she found herself staring at account statements that showed her trust fund not only intact but significantly larger than it had been when it disappeared 8 months earlier. The balance had grown from the original $97,000 to nearly $115,000, reflecting careful investment management throughout the entire period when she'd believed the money was lost forever. She read through the documents twice before the reality sank in completely. Every dollar was accounted for. Every transaction documented. Every investment decision explained in detailed notes that showed months of careful attention to market conditions and portfolio optimization. The money had never been lost at all. It had been moved, managed, and protected by someone who understood financial markets far better than she'd ever given them credit for. Attached to the statements was a letter in my handwriting, dated 3 days earlier but clearly written much longer ago, based on references to conversations and events from throughout her months of working in my office. The letter explained everything: my decision to hide the trust fund, my reasons for letting her believe it was lost, my observations about her transformation during the months when she thought her financial safety net had disappeared. "My dear Jessica," the letter began, If you're reading this, it means you've spent enough time in my world to understand the difference between losing something and misplacing it, between genuine carelessness and strategic invisibility. You accused me of always losing things, and I decided to show you what it looks like when I lose something on purpose. The letter went on to explain the investment strategy I'd employed with her money during the months of its disappearance. I'd moved it into municipal bonds and dividend-paying stocks that had outperformed the market while providing steady income. I'd reinvested the returns, rebalanced the portfolio quarterly, and protected the principal through careful diversification that reflected 30 years of experience managing money during volatile periods. You thought my disorganized methods meant I was incompetent with money, the letter continued. But competence isn't always visible from the outside. Sometimes the most careful stewardship looks careless to people who don't understand the system. Your trust fund was never safer than during the months when you couldn't find it. Jessica sat in stunned silence as she absorbed the implications of what she was reading. Every panic-filled day of searching for her missing money, every desperate application for minimum wage jobs, every night of lying awake worried about her financial future, all of it had been unnecessary. The security she'd thought was lost had been there all along, carefully protected by the mother she'd accused of financial irresponsibility. But as the initial shock wore off, she began to understand that the lesson went far deeper than simply proving my competence with money management. The months of thinking she was financially vulnerable had taught her things that no amount of security could have provided. She'd learned to value work for its meaning rather than its salary, to find purpose in helping others rather than accumulating wealth for herself, to build her identity around capabilities rather than assets. You needed to learn what real security feels like, the letter explained. It doesn't come from having money in the bank or trust funds that you never earned. It comes from being able to create value, solve problems, and help people in ways that can't be automated or eliminated. You had to lose your artificial security to discover your genuine strength. The timing of the revelation was perfect, arriving just as Jessica was preparing to take her final certification exams and begin building her own client relationships. She'd spent months developing skills and knowledge that would serve her throughout her career, but she'd also developed something more valuable: the humility that comes from understanding how quickly circumstances can change and how little control anyone really has over external events. She looked up from the letter to find me standing in the doorway of my office, watching her process the information with the kind of patient attention I'd learned to give clients during difficult conversations. I didn't apologize or justify or explain further. I simply waited for her to absorb the full implications of what had happened and decide how she wanted to respond. "You let me suffer for 8 months, she said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of anger, relief, and something approaching admiration. You watched me panic about money, take on work I was overqualified for, worry about basic survival, all while you knew my trust fund was perfectly safe." I nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of her assessment without defensiveness. "Yes, because you needed to learn that your worth isn't determined by your bank balance, your job title, or your investment portfolio. You needed to discover what you're capable of when everything else is stripped away." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Jessica challenged me on the ethics of my decision, questioned whether the lessons I'd intended to teach justified the emotional cost of my deception, and forced me to defend my methods in ways that revealed as much about my own motivations as hers. She was no longer the frightened, desperate woman who had returned home unemployed and broke. She was someone who could hold her ground in difficult conversations and demand accountability from people she respected. "I understand why you did it," she said after we'd talked through the implications for nearly an hour. "And I can even appreciate the results. But you took an enormous risk with my psychological well-being. What if I hadn't been able to handle the stress? What if I'd made destructive decisions based on thinking I had no safety net?" These were fair questions that I'd considered throughout the months of watching her struggle. The plan had required enormous faith in her resilience and character, faith that wasn't always easy to maintain during her darkest periods of unemployment and financial anxiety. I'd been prepared to end the experiment if she'd shown signs of genuine psychological distress, but she'd proven stronger and more adaptable than either of us had expected. "The greatest gift you can give someone isn't money or security," I told her. "It's confidence in their own ability to handle whatever life brings them." You now know that you can survive job loss, financial setbacks, and complete uncertainty about your future. That knowledge is worth more than any trust fund could ever be. Jessica spent the rest of the week processing the revelation and its implications for her relationship with me, her understanding of security, and her plans for the future. The trust fund was still there, still hers, still growing under management that had proven far more sophisticated than she'd ever imagined. But it no longer felt like the foundation of her financial security. Instead, she'd built her security on skills that couldn't be lost to market crashes or corporate restructuring. She'd developed expertise in an area where her value would only increase with experience and relationship building. She'd learned to find meaning in work that made a difference in people's lives rather than just generating income for herself or profits for shareholders. More importantly, she discovered that her mother's apparently disorganized methods masked a depth of competence and strategic thinking that she'd never bothered to investigate before dismissing them as outdated. The woman she'd accused of always losing things had actually demonstrated remarkable skill at protecting and growing assets, while teaching invaluable lessons about resilience and self-reliance. The day Jessica received her financial planning certification, we celebrated with dinner at the same restaurant where I'd taken her to celebrate her college graduation 6 years earlier. But this felt different, not like the culmination of someone else's expectations, but like the beginning of something she'd chosen for herself based on genuine understanding of what the work involved and what it could accomplish. "I want to propose a partnership," she said over dessert, her voice carrying the confidence that comes from having tested your capabilities under pressure and found them sufficient. "Not you hiring me or giving me charity work, but a real business partnership where we're equals contributing different strengths to serve clients better than either of us could alone." The proposal made sense on multiple levels. My experience and client relationships, combined with her technology skills and fresh perspective, could create something more valuable than the sum of its parts. But more importantly, it represented the completion of a circle that had begun with her dismissal of my work and culminated in her recognition of its value and her desire to continue building on its foundation. We spent the next several weeks developing plans for Martinez and Martinez Financial Planning, a practice that would honor the relationship-based approach I developed over 30 years, while incorporating the technological improvements and educational innovations Jessica had contributed during her months of learning the business. She would handle client education and communication while I focused on investment strategy and relationship management, creating a division of labor that played to both of our strengths. The trust fund became the initial capital for her stake in the partnership, transformed from a safety net she'd never earned into an investment in a business she'd helped build. It felt appropriate that money she'd once taken for granted would now be risked on her own efforts to create value for others, that financial security she'd assumed would always be there would now depend on her ability to serve clients well enough that they chose to continue working with us. Our first joint client presentation was for a young couple facing the same kinds of financial decisions Jessica had been making before her unemployment crisis changed everything. They needed help with student loan repayment, retirement planning, and saving for a house down payment while managing limited income and uncertain career prospects. It was exactly the kind of situation where traditional financial planning often failed because it focused on technical optimization rather than behavioral sustainability. Jessica handled the educational component, explaining how small, consistent investments could grow over time and helping them understand the emotional challenges that would arise during market volatility periods. I provided the investment strategy and ongoing guidance framework, drawing on decades of experience with similar clients who had successfully built wealth despite modest starting points and multiple financial setbacks. The combination worked beautifully. The clients felt understood and supported rather than overwhelmed and inadequate. They left with a plan they could actually implement, and emotional preparation for the challenges they would face along the way. Most importantly, they understood that financial planning was an ongoing relationship rather than a one-time transaction, a partnership that would evolve as their circumstances changed. That evening, as we reviewed the meeting and planned our follow-up communication with the new clients, Jessica made an observation that captured how completely her perspective had transformed since her months of believing her trust fund was lost. A year ago, I would have told them to maximize their 401k contributions and invest in low-cost index funds and not worry about market volatility because it always recovers over time, she said. But that's not what they needed to hear. They needed someone to understand their fears about money and help them build confidence in their ability to make good financial decisions, even when everything feels uncertain. She had learned the difference between providing information and providing guidance, between technical expertise and practical wisdom, between optimizing for mathematical efficiency and optimizing for human behavior. These were lessons that couldn't be taught in certification programs or learned from textbooks. They came from watching people make both wise and foolish financial decisions and understanding the patterns that separated success from failure. The practice grew steadily over the following months, attracting clients who appreciated our combination of technical competence and emotional intelligence. Jessica's educational workshops became popular throughout the San Diego financial planning community, and her approach to client communication was studied by other advisors who wanted to improve their own practices. She had found her professional calling in work that utilized all of her skills while making a meaningful difference in people's lives. But perhaps the most significant change was in our relationship. The daughter who had once dismissed my work as outdated now understood its value better than most people in the financial services industry. She'd learned to see competence in places where it wasn't immediately obvious, to distinguish between surface-level organization and genuine effectiveness, to value wisdom that came from experience rather than credentials. The trust fund that had started this whole journey now felt like the least important part of the story. It was still there, still growing, still providing security that Jessica valued more than she had when she'd taken it for granted. But it was no longer the foundation of her financial well-being or her sense of self-worth. She'd built something more durable and more meaningful, the ability to create value, solve problems, and help people in ways that would serve her throughout her career. On the anniversary of the day she'd first discovered the missing trust fund, Jessica left an envelope on my desk with a letter of her own. It thanked me for the difficult lessons that had changed the direction of her life, for the faith I'd shown in her ability to handle adversity, and for the patience I'd demonstrated while she learned to see the world through different eyes. "You were right about losing things," the letter concluded. "Sometimes you have to lose what you think you need in order to find what you actually need." I lost my trust fund and found my purpose. I lost my security and found my strength. I lost my assumptions about work and found my calling. Thank you for helping me discover that the most valuable things can't be lost because they live inside us rather than in bank accounts. The woman who had once accused me of always losing things had learned that some losses are gifts in disguise, that apparent chaos can mask careful strategy, and that real security comes from capabilities rather than assets. She discovered that financial planning at its best wasn't about maximizing returns, but about maximizing peace of mind, not about accumulating wealth, but about building resilience. Most importantly, she'd learned that competence isn't always visible from the outside, that some of the most important work happens quietly without recognition, and that success can be measured in ways that have nothing to do with traditional markers of achievement. The daughter who had returned home broken and defeated had become a partner who contributed as much as she received, a professional who understood that helping others achieve security was more rewarding than accumulating it for herself. The trust fund was safe, growing steadily under management that had proven far more sophisticated than anyone could have guessed from my apparently disorganized methods. But more importantly, Jessica was safe. Not because she had money in the bank, but because she had skills that would serve her regardless of what economic challenges the future might bring. She'd learned the difference between having wealth and building wealth, between financial independence and financial wisdom, between security that could be lost and strength that would last a lifetime. These were lessons that no trust fund could have provided, insights that came only from discovering what you're capable of when everything else has been stripped away. The legacy I'd hoped to pass on wasn't money or property or professional credentials. It was the understanding that real security comes from within, that competence often looks different than people expect, and that the most valuable gifts sometimes come disguised as losses. Jessica had received that inheritance in full, and she was already passing it on to clients who needed the same wisdom that had transformed her own relationship with money and security. The story that had begun with accusations about losing things had ended with the discovery that some things can only be found by first being lost, that apparent failure often precedes genuine success, and that the most important lessons are learned not in classrooms but in the crucible of real experience, where everything you thought you knew is tested against the complexity of actual life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.